good morning, everyone, or good day to everyone from wherever you may be tuning in today. And welcome to our second webinar in the series, Access to Remedy, today focusing on sharing responsibility with suppliers. This webinar is organized by both the Social and Economic Council for the Netherlands and the Initiative for Global Solidarity, a project implemented by GIZ. My name is Mora, and I will be your moderator today with the behind-the-scenes support from my colleagues of the Social and Economic Council, Sejan Redieva-Smit and Luz Jacobs. Okay, now let us do a little bit of a recap of what we did last time. During our first webinar, which took place in March of this year, we shed light into one of the vehicles towards remedy along supply chains, the supply chain grievance mechanisms. We had companies from the electronics and textile sector give us insight on how they set up grievance mechanisms along their supply chains and which industry initiatives they have selected to support their endeavors towards human rights and environmental due diligence. And additionally, we had experts share their knowledge on what current legislation on human rights and environmental due diligence mean for companies and how to practically address their obligations. The background and motivation for the session hasn't deviated that much in comparison to our last session. Legislations such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive are indeed putting pressure on companies and on them setting up due diligence processes along their supply chains. So risk management systems, grievance mechanisms, and traceability issues are high on the agenda of companies. And this pressure is leading to uncoordinated and isolated quick fixes and tick box approaches at a cross-sectoral level. Thus, it is the Social and Economic Councils and the Initiative for Global Solidarity's objective to contribute to the conversation at cross-sectoral level to enable exchange between companies and other relevant stakeholders in order to harmonize approaches, identify synergies, and pool resources. Therefore, today we are taking a step forward and approaching the topic of access to remedy from a joint perspective. Buying companies and producing companies working together to share the responsibility of setting up grievance and remedy mechanisms. In theory and under all the ideal conditions, buying companies and producing companies work together towards the same goal of respecting human rights and remediating human rights violations along the supply chain. This, however, looks much more complex in practice, and we all know conditions are currently far from ideal. Therefore, we pose the following questions. How do companies share responsibility? Where do opportunities and challenges lie? What is needed from a systemic level for industries to reach better conditions towards granting access to remedy? Is it better purchasing practices? Is it better support for manufacturers in their in-factory grievance mechanisms? Maybe all of the above? Let us hear from actual companies on what they do and what their outlook on the matter is. But before we delve into the practicalities of the challenge and industry examples, let us hear once more from experts in social justice and labor standards. The International Labour Organization over the years has formulated recommendations, guidelines, and principles to address human rights concerns from workers within supply chains, for example, and amongst others, through in-factory grievance mechanisms. Thus, today we have Valérie van Goethem from the International Labour Organization, who will be providing us with an overview of the aforementioned on behalf of the ILO. Through her input, we aim to contribute to the understanding of access to remedy beyond HREDD legislation and the compliance requirements. So welcome, Valérie, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. I'm Valérie van Goethem, indeed, a labor law specialist in the labor law unit here in ILO Geneva. The ILO has a long-standing collaboration both with GIZ and with the Dutch Economic and Social Council, especially through the Better Work program. So it's a true pleasure to be here with you. And indeed, I was invited to actually recap a bit international guidance on effective grievance handling. So let me perhaps share my screen with a PowerPoint presentation, if you don't mind. So let me recap a bit the international labor guidance on access to justice, access to labor justice, as we call it, and more specifically on grievance handling. So as you all know, access to justice has come to be recognized as a key element of the rule of law that is enshrined in the SDG number 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Access to justice is central to making human rights, including labor rights, a reality for all workers and individuals. However, while there is an increased guidance that is being given on the broad principles of access to justice in general, less is known and less is being developed on access to labor justice, meaning on actually labor dispute prevention and resolution in modern workplaces, including in supply chains. So the ILO has a comprehensive body of international labor standards, as you know, 190 conventions, 206 recommendations, 5 protocols. But as it stands today, there is no single international labor standards that deals directly in a holistic, comprehensive manner with the issue of dispute resolution, meaning dispute resolution as a whole, dispute resolution system entailing both individual and collective disputes, entailing both state-based and non-state-based mechanisms, judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. So as it stands today, there is no single ILS providing guidance in this area, but for your information, there is a discussion nowadays in the governing body of the ILO to actually decide about the possibility of having in the future a normative action, a new instrument on access to labor justice. So basically, the guidance that is being provided by international labor standards on dispute resolution is quite fragmented across different conventions and recommendations, and interesting elements were included in recent conventions, in particular about remedies, about accessibility of remedies, about grievances in typically the latest convention adopted, Convention 190 on violence and harassment at work. But here today, I will be focusing on one specific recommendation, which you may know, recommendation 130, which addresses specifically the issue of grievance examination. Other two recommendations, number 92 and number 94, respectively on voluntary conciliation and arbitration and on cooperation at the level of the undertaking, might also be interesting in our discussion. But I will be focusing on recommendation 130. Just as a starting point, I would like to also recall, this recommendation 130 was adopted in 1967, a long time ago indeed, and it now needs to be also looked at in a broader context in the light also of more recent guidance that is being given both by the ILO and by the UN. So when it comes to the ILO, the 2017 revised tripartite declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy, more specifically the points 65 and 66, which are displayed on the screen, which relate to the importance of ensuring enabling remediation for abuses of labor rights violations, especially in those countries, in those contexts where violation of fundamental principles and rights at work take place, where freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining are not fully respected, where there are issues of discrimination, child labor, forced labor, and safe and healthy working environment. The second international guidance I would like to refer to here, of course, are the 2011 UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which you may all be familiar with, in particular the principles number 29 and 31, which relate to the importance for businesses to establish and participate in effective operational level grievance mechanisms and to ensure that those operational level grievance mechanisms are effective in practice. So nowadays, establishing effective grievance handling at the company level has been included in many HRDD laws and has become a due diligence obligation. So let's have a look at the guidance given by recommendation 130 more in detail. But before that, I just wanted to recap a bit the framework of labor dispute settlement for those of you who might not be fully familiar with all those terms. So basically, I mean, the main differences, the main avenues, the differences in the nature of claims when it comes to labor disputes. Broadly speaking, if I may, I would say there are three distinctions that need to be drawn. As you may know again, the first distinction is between rights-based disputes and interest-based disputes. So typically rights disputes are about alleged violations of established rights. They involve deciding whether the company is respecting applicable regulations. And here, for rights-based dispute, grievance handling is an appropriate avenue. Interest-based disputes, as you may know, are about seeking an agreement through negotiation, collective bargaining, about whether the applicable regulation should be changed. So basically, it's about negotiating about potentially new rights. And interest-based disputes are not for workplace grievance handling in general, but for collective bargaining practices and procedures in most instances. So basically, with the example of wage pay, if you take the example of an employer that does not pay workers the proper rates of wage as set up in the employment contract or the collective agreement, this would be a grievance because a right, an established right, is at stake. However, in the situation where workers would want to be paid more, would want their wage to be increased, there might be an interest dispute here. Even though the company might actually pay the appropriate rate of wage, there is an interest in having better wages. The second distinction is about the difference between individual and collective disputes. So obviously individual disputes involve a single worker, and collective disputes involve a group of workers that are usually represented by a trade union. The third distinction is about the settlement avenues. So claim can be pursued either through non-state-based mechanisms or state-based mechanisms, or both. Ideally, of course, both state-based and non-state-based, to have a comprehensive, holistic system of labor dispute prevention and resolution. So ideally, countries should establish and ensure an interrelation and a coordination of workplace grievance handling mechanisms, non-state, with the rest of the system, non-judicial dispute resolution, mediation, conciliation provided by state-based bodies, and judicial proceedings as well. Moving to the recommendation 130. So here, it is important to recall that this recommendation applies at the level of the company for rights-based disputes, as we just saw, not for interest disputes. The basic principles are that every worker should have the right to submit a grievance without suffering any prejudice whatsoever as a result, and the grievances could be submitted individually or collectively. So you could have individual grievances or collective grievances submitted by workers. And the second basic principle of recommendation 130 is that any grievances submitted should be examined via an effective procedure, which is open to all workers as far as possible, settled within the undertaking. And again, the third point here is to ensure that grievance handling is unlikely to be effective as an exclusive remedy. They should be part of a broader system of labor dispute prevention and resolution that includes both internal company and external state-based remedial processes. Now, a key dimension of recommendation 130 is voluntarism and effectiveness. So voluntary solution means that the ILO's approach to grievance handling places a firm emphasis on finding solutions that are worked out in dialogue, in social dialogue between workers and the employer within the enterprise. And this makes sense because in many instances, grievance may be the result of honest mistakes or differences in interpretations that are relatively easy to resolve without resorting to more formal procedures. At the same time, given the imbalance of power between an individual worker and the employer, it is important to highlight that the importance of ensuring that genuine efforts are provided to ensure a fair outcome of the process. So the first point here is that the procedure, the grievance handling procedures within the enterprise should offer a real possibility of arriving at a settlement at every stage, meaning that grievance procedures should not be just a series of administrative complicated steps, but should provide for a real possibility of arriving at a settlement. For instance, here it is important to ensure that the employer representative in the grievance handling should be someone who actually has the authority to resolve the grievance. The employer representative in the grievance handling should have the authority, the power to actually resolve the grievance. Another condition, for instance, is to ensure that when, in the case of a grievance that concerns the behavior of an individual manager, there should be a possibility for the worker concerned to bring their complaint in the first instance, not before that specific individual manager, which is at stake, but before another employer representative. So those are examples of concrete practices that may ensure the reality of the possibility to settle the grievance. So another important point is to ensure that if an acceptable solution cannot be found at the first level between the worker and their first or second line supervisors, it should be possible to take the grievance to a more senior level management. So this is an important point made in the recommendation. When it comes to the grounds for the grievances, basically recommendation 130 provides that the grounds can be any measure, any situation which concerns the relation between the employer and the worker, which affects or which may affect. So there is a possibility also to anticipate the possibility of a grievance, and speak and address situations which may affect the condition of employment, even if the problem hasn't arisen yet. The two other important points here are to ensure relate to the connection between grievance handling and other avenues. Firstly, it is important to ensure that if workers remain unsatisfied with internal procedures, once internal procedures have been exhausted, there should be the possibility to resolve the grievance through other avenues, judicial or non-judicial state-based avenues. And at the same time, there should also be the possibility for the workers to make their complaint directly through external state-based dispute settlement processes. So basically, grievance handling should be optional. Grievance handling should remain an optional first step before raising the complaint, bringing the claim before other state-based bodies. Besides voluntarism and effectiveness, the other main point of recommendation 130 is procedural fairness. So what does procedural fairness mean? Firstly, the importance of widely communicating about grievance handling procedures at the level of the enterprise. Then ensuring that the grievance handling procedures are as uncomplicated and rapid as possible. Placing time limits at each stages might help also ensuring the rapidity, the celerity of the procedure. So grievance should not disappear into a complex institutional machinery with little or no indication about when a resolution can be offered. So process as simple as possible. This is really key. And then, of course, the importance of ensuring that the workers have the right to be present and to participate in the procedure, ensuring that the workers have the right to be assisted or represented by a trade union representative or any other persons of workers chosen, because even in the most informal processes, grievance handling can remain intimidating for many workers. So they should be allowed to bring a trusted representative to help them making their case. And then last 2 points here, very importantly, ensuring that the grievance handling guarantees that workers should not suffer any loss of earnings as a result of the time taken to participate in the procedure. There must also be no hidden indirect costs for attempting to claim their rights. So workers who file a grievance should not suffer any prejudice whatsoever, be it in terms of discipline, in transfer, demotion, victimization, financial harm. So this is a really key principle, key point of recommendation 130. Now, in practice, how can grievance handling be developed? ILO guidance here provides that grievance handling can be put in practice via national laws and regulations or collective agreements or company rules. What matters really here is to ensure that workers and their representatives be consulted and participate not only in the establishment, but also in the functioning, in the implementation of grievance handling. The best way here is to associate workers and workers' representatives by way of agreement, by way of a formal agreement on the establishment of the grievance procedure. In some instances, companies may actually establish specific procedures for discrimination cases, for harassment cases, or for cases involving health and safety at work. So depending on the company, depending on the countries, you may have a general grievance handling procedure and specific grievance handling procedure in certain specific areas. So in practice as well, it is really a good practice, I would say, to ensure that companies keep a separate unit in charge of grievance handling. Even if grievance handling procedures are not state-based procedure, it is key to ensure independence and impartiality of the procedure, and having a separate unit in the company in charge of grievance handling is an excellent practice, good practice that is being recommended also by the ILO. So this is really what I wanted to share briefly. I went a bit over the allocated time. As a conclusion, I mean, reiterating that workplace grievance is key, but they should be complementary to state-based labor dispute prevention and resolution avenues, genuine consultation and participation of workers to ensure legitimacy and effectiveness, ensuring that the grievance handling meets certain effectiveness criteria in terms of speediness, fairness, voluntarism, communication, accessibility, and so on. And of course, when it comes to supply chain, there is a specific issue that relates to the leverage that lead companies can exercise over their suppliers to establish their own grievance processes, and even to establish link between grievance handling established by suppliers and grievance handling at the level of the lead company. So linking grievance handling and across the supply chain, across suppliers and lead companies, and linking grievance handling with a broader national system is critical. Now, more is needed in terms of quantity and quality of information on the resolution of grievances and remedies. The ILO is working on it as well with its partners, but this is really certainly an area where more can be done in terms of research and data collection. Let me reiterate here that the ILO can provide assistance to strengthen the effectiveness of grievance handling procedures, because quite often grievance handlings are more stronger in design than in implementation. So this is really an area where the ILO can help as well. This is all I wanted to say. You will be receiving my presentation, I guess. Let me show here some of the recent publications, recent guidance instruments from the ILO on the area of grievance handling, including a new tool to assess the effectiveness of dispute resolution institutions, which is more for the at the national level, but can be used also somehow can be adjusted and adapted for other types of mechanisms. And this is it. Thank you so much, and I'm available, of course. I remain for the Q&A session afterwards if you have any questions. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Valérie, for this great overview. I mean, you already summarized most of your key points and takeaways, but I think there will be a great linkage to your presentation now on one of the last points on leverage, because we're addressing today sharing responsibility with the supplier. And so I think we'll get deeper into that in a short moment. And another point that I wanted to also accentuate is after your presentation, it is quite clear that when companies would like to implement grievance mechanisms, that they should have some sort of mapping, which already existing avenues for remediation are there, and which issues are being covered by these grievance mechanisms. So sometimes we see emerging grievance mechanisms that want to be all-encompassing and address every issue and address every stakeholder's issue, and it is not effective, and it is not ideal. But so thank you very much for this. And yes, stick around for our Q&A. And for the audience, if you have any questions for Valérie, then feel free to post them in the chat and we'll get to them later on. So let us move along to our industry speakers. So joining us today, we have Helmut Philipp, Sustainability Manager at Ford Motor Company, Fatima Chowdhury, Senior Sustainability Manager at the German textile retailer Tchibo. And finally, to enhance our message to promote a shared responsibility, we have Matthijs Kritte, Secretary General of the International Apparel Federation, representing the perspective of suppliers and manufacturers. Now let us hear from the supplier side to start us off within the textiles and garment sector through Matthijs Kritte. Matthijs, welcome to the webinar. Fortunately, we have Tchibo on the panel later on, so that we can complement the picture for the sector with a buyer's perspective. But let us jump right in with a couple of questions for you. So supply chain collaboration is essential for effective HREDD implementation. So how can suppliers work collaboratively with brands, retailers, and other stakeholders to share responsibility and collectively address human rights issues? And are there any successful partnership models or initiatives that you can highlight?
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, Sociaal-Economic Council and GIZ for inviting us to this panel to talk about this important topic. Two-sentence introduction of myself, so that you understand the context. Matthijs Kritte, based in the Netherlands, working for a global federation for the apparel industry. Our members are industry associations. Many of them are associations representing garment manufacturers in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, and in Europe. So your question about supply chain collaboration, I would like to go back a little bit to the core. The collaboration is essential because I think the nature of the buyer-supplier relation itself is such an integral part of human rights and environmental due diligence. And so you mentioned purchasing practices before, and we sometimes say they can be considered one of the biggest risk factors, to stay within the lingo of due diligence, one of the biggest risk factors for adverse conditions in the supply chain. So this fact prompted the IAF to really focus on purchasing practices, and with the great support actually of GIZ, we founded a collaboration called the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative, STTI. And this is essentially a start to pull together manufacturers themselves as a prerequisite to then have a collaboration, industry-wide collaboration across the supply chain with brands and retailers. But first, we needed to take that step where manufacturers are actually collaborating. So this STTI initiative is made up of 13 associations from 10 countries. If we go really quickly from west to east, that's Morocco, Turkey, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, China, Cambodia, and Indonesia. And together they make up about 3/4 of the global manufacturing capacity in garments in the world. So it's really a substantial collaboration. And then having actually formulated what these manufacturers thought would be correct purchasing practices, taking this forward, this vision, are steps to collaborate with brands and retailers. So the collaboration goes mostly through collective groups of brands and retailers, which include, for instance, the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices, which is itself a collaboration of multi-stakeholder initiatives, including Fair Wear Foundation and ETI that work with many medium-sized brands, the SAC, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, ACT, and together, STTI is a collaboration of manufacturers is speaking about how to, in practice, improve purchasing practices and create accountability on that with these groups of brands and retailers. So this is actually happening as we speak.
Right, thank you. And you have mentioned already more than a couple of these initiatives, and I would like to focus as well on these actors, right? So the suppliers there, I mean, if you put them together in a room, I'm assuming that their capacities, not only in the topic of collaborating on purchasing practices, but generally also on human rights and environmental due diligence, their capacities may vary. So what support and resources can be offered to help suppliers develop the necessary skills and knowledge and capacity for HREDD implementation? What is clearly missing, and where are opportunities that could be used in this case?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because it's really important that the knowledge level is improved. And I think again here it's good to go back to the basics. I remember at the start of the OECD guidance, due diligence guidance on garment and footwear process. I think that's about 7 years ago. There was a chairman of the Working Party for Responsible Business Conduct of the OECD, Roel Nieuwenkamp. And he said, well, this process, due diligence, this allows for more even playing field between brands and retailers. And that understanding, that basic understanding of what the due diligence concept can bring to manufacturers is often lacking. And that is a pity, because if that basic understanding is there, then it would be much easier to make progress in when asking questions to manufacturers. Would you be able to do this? Would you be able to do that? Including, for instance, participation in grievance mechanisms, right? But what often happens if the basic understanding is missing is that due diligence coming, for instance, from European Union in terms of legislation is seen as something that is put into the bucket of audit schemes, right? It is seen as an additional burden on manufacturers, and unfortunately sometimes that is what it is, right? And we always say due diligence is a risk sharing exercise and an effort sharing exercise, and not a risk transferal exercise or an effort transferal exercise, because then the implementation of due diligence actually shoots itself in its own foot, right? It goes against itself. It actually creates worse purchasing practices by moving additional, an additional workload onto manufacturers. So I think the capacity to implement due diligence for manufacturers should always start with a fantastic basic understanding of this concept and how it can work in their favor. And once that's accomplished, then you can explain much better to manufacturers, look, it is a two-way street. So also something is expected from you, right? And what is expected is also extensive. I mean, garment manufacturers have the key to unlocking information coming from further upstream. If we want to know what's going on in the textile and the spinning mills and the textile mills and even the farms, somebody has to gather that in that information, and may even be an opportunity for manufacturers, right? Because they can say, look, we can offer you a great product, but we can also offer you great information, which is what you need to comply with legislation. And because we have been starting off on a more collaborative and less transactional relationship, we also feel free as manufacturers to talk about the price of information, right? And a colleague of mine sometimes comes with an example from the agricultural industry where they had a project also on due diligence and information about environment in the agricultural sector, talking about oranges. So basically a supplier said, look, I can sell you an orange for price A without information, and I can sell you an orange for price B, which is higher, with information, right? And there's a difference there. So I think if you are asking about capacity of suppliers to implement due diligence, we really have to work together to look at the basics and to work with the associations, which can act as multipliers in an industry, because if they understand it, they can then organize their own events and seminars and talk to their members as they do. That's their job, and then explain these foundations. And then each individual manufacturer that understands this can be more self-conscious and or be how shall I put it, more confident to raise this topic and to work from a more equal level when talking to its clients, because that's also in the interest of the client, because if it does that, it itself implements due diligence in the correct way and not in the wrong way.
And I think,
yeah.
Well, that's a perfect segue for the next question, because as you mentioned, the first prerequisite is for everyone to have a uniform understanding, right? And very good basic understanding, and that both players, buying companies and producing companies, can identify the added value, right, of due diligence processes. And working collaboratively. But moving a step forward, so assuming that all conditions are ideal, we know that there are also costs, and not just monetary, but also capacity-wise, are very high when implementing due diligence measures. So focusing on effective grievance and remedy mechanisms, how can suppliers be encouraged and supported to set up robust internal grievance mechanisms that allow workers and affected stakeholders to raise concern and seek redress? Or are there any examples?
Yeah. Well, I don't have exact examples now, but I know the examples are there when I speak to people, especially the ones working with some of the MSIs, right? Working in a more collaborative way, brands and retailers on the one hand and manufacturers on the other hand, can then sit together and try to find out what are the best mechanisms to get to certain information. And the voice of the worker is extremely important for a number of reasons, right? It gives both the buyer and the manufacturer more confidence if a good system is set up. That the real information is uncovered, and this makes the manufacturer, on the one hand, a more attractive party to the supplier, but on the other hand, always a more open communication between all of the parties, and that includes the workers, leads to better business results. That is very, very often the case. So getting back to that point, I think the value of information is enormous. Usually translates into better business conduct, but it does require, as I said before, this foundation of trust, I think, and a good understanding of what due diligence really means. Let me give you one other reply, which is often overlooked, I think, and that is where the money comes from to pay for additional work, controls, information flow, because this is all not free, and we know how difficult it is to translate this to higher prices for products in the market. And this is a very important topic, but what is also overlooked is how much money is locked away in this supply chain in excess inventories, how much money is lost by making products that in the end have to be sold at a discount. In 1970, 7% of our products was sold at a discount. Now it's more than 50%. So we have a very, very ineffective system. To make that more effective, to actually produce the goods that we, the consumers, want, can create the additional funds that are needed to pay workers more, that are needed to install robust systems. But to get there needs also more buyer-supplier collaboration, right? Those transactional systems are not only bad for workers very often, but also bad for business in the end. And so if you get a different buyer-supplier relationship going, it can lead to sort of an upward spiral, improving, reducing the ineffectiveness of the business, unlocking funds that can be spent on sustainability. So it's those kind of links that we should be looking at.
Exactly. Thank you very much for your answers, Matthijs. I think you've made it very clear that there are necessary steps to take, and I don't think that we're yet there that we could, harvest a lot of the fruits. But we know you mentioned a couple of initiatives that are doing a lot of work on collaborative approaches, on purchasing practices, and due diligence measures in collaboration between buyers and suppliers. So I think that the textile sector is already paving the way. So I think with this in mind, I would like to move forward to also give the word to other industries that may not be as far ahead as the textile sector. But thank you, Matthijs. I know you have to leave, so thank you very much for being here. And see you soon.
Sorry I have to leave. Thank you very much, and good luck, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'd like to maybe jump a little bit into another industry and then dial back to the textile sector. We have Helmut Philipp today with us. Hi, Helmut. I would jump over to Ford and a short overview of the automotive sector. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. What does Ford do to comply with HREDD requirements regarding specifically grievance mechanism, and how does Ford work with its supplier on the topic?
Thanks, Maria. I've prepared a small presentation, but probably first to my person. My name is Helmut Philipp. I'm a sustainability manager here at Ford, and I'm primarily concerned with legislations and how we should respond to it, and also what it means for our supply chain. So I appreciate the opportunity to share some learnings here in this forum. And I think we have heard that before, but I can also mirror that. I strongly believe that cooperation is key for developing sustainable supply chains. So with that, let me start with some background on Ford Motor Company. Ford and sustainability really has a tradition. We were the first to publish an automotive sustainability report in 1999. And even until today, we continue to achieve top rankings for protecting human rights. And that is also reflected by recent publications. Supplier network. Later, we will focus on the supply base and supplier engagement. So just to put things into perspective, and also probably with the often heard textile industry, I would like to give you some key figures to illustrate the Ford production supply landscape. We have contracted more than 4,500 suppliers, and these sites supply almost 200,000 parts into our Ford plants that are located in 67 different countries all around the world. And our supply chain has up to 6 layers and sometimes even more. So as you can see, it's a complex setup, and that is the reason why I prefer to call it a supplier network rather than a linear supply chain. So now to the question on how we in Ford respond to the requirements of a grievance mechanism. And before I go into more detail, let me clarify. I will focus on the external. Ford internal complaints handling is not subject of this presentation. Whenever we develop an approach or a process, we ensure that it is aligned to the Ford values. And as mentioned before, human rights is a priority for us. We value our supplier partners, and so a good relation is key. And Ford is a business, hence we must use our resources in an efficient manner. That summarizes some of the criteria that define what I would call a Ford fit for our processes. And of course, the grievance mechanism must be compliant, and we look at it now, compliance to the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So it must be easy to file a complaint no matter where you are. Your identity must be protected, and measures must be in place to avoid retaliation. So how has Ford actually designed the grievance mechanism? To facilitate access to remedy along our supplier network, we have established 2 external grievance channels. One, the RBA Voices app, which is situated at the supplier side, and the complaint web form that is located on the Ford homepage. Let's have a closer look at the Ford web form channel. On the Ford website, you will find a link that starts the grievance system. The system provides guidance and helps with filing the actual complaint, considering full protection of personal data. And it's really easy to find. You can even Google for Ford grievance mechanism, and it will take you there. Once the complaint is filed in the system and the violation is validated, the Ford Sustainability Department starts the remediation procedure. This is where I work. This also includes the collaboration with the affected parties in the supplier network, and always the goal is to stop the violation immediately. We also cooperate with RBA, because if teamwork with other customers is required to solve the case, we involve RBA as the third party. They take the lead and facilitate the collaboration on providing remedy. And I have to stress, it is essential to have a third party in the loop to avoid any trust law issues. Another reason why we work with RBA is escalation. At any time, the complainant can press the escalation button on the web form. This will immediately involve RBA as an independent mediator. RBA also works with organizations like NGOs or union that can provide help on site. And even after a case is closed, the escalation button is still working. So we offer continued help in case of retaliation or any other issues. Yeah, in summary, on the Ford homepage, everyone from everywhere can request remedy. The RBA Voices app is designed to solve supplier worker complaints where they occur in the plant. We offer this application free of charge to our Tier 1 suppliers, and let's have a look how it works. During the system setup, posters will be printed, and they contain a simple explanation for the workers and a QR code to start the complaint process with a smartphone. These posters must be displayed on site so that they are clearly visible for all employees. Once the grievance mechanism is started, the system provides the same functionality and security as the Ford web form. Sorry. The worker can also escalate to RBA, and even RBA can escalate to Ford if our involvement is required. So that was a brief overview of the two external grievance channels that we offer. This slide here tries to simplify a rather complex process. So I guess that maybe leaves some room for questions later.
But so
back to you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview, Helmut. So we see that Ford is relying on several grievance channels, such as the Ford webpage and the RBA channel, while also assuring that these mechanisms complement each other, or at least that they speak to one another. So that can, of course, strengthen Ford's strategy to grant access to remedy across the supply chain. However, I can imagine that sounds simpler than how it really is. So now, what are the opportunities and challenges that Ford has identified in its journey to set up grievance mechanisms along its supply chain?
Yeah. What are the opportunities and challenges that we have found during the introduction of a grievance mechanism? And I want to focus on three opportunities and three challenges as they explain a little bit, I would call it two sides of the coin story. The first opportunity that we found is grievance mechanism readiness. The good news is that the suppliers that are in scope of and we are looking at primarily from the view of the German Due Diligence Act. So the suppliers that are in scope are aware of the associated requirements, and most have grievance systems already in place. However, many are still reluctant to share their supply base. Sourcing is rated as commercially sensitive, so we have limited visibility of our sub-suppliers, which is an issue for proper supply base due diligence. Second, the law is pretty clear on the obligations, so the resulting requirements for our suppliers are accepted with basically no resistance. Nevertheless, given the due diligence obligations, we expected that suppliers would deal more transparently with human rights and environmental issues. But we still see a culture of hiding issues rather than transparently looking for collaboration. So we still have a long way to go here. Another opportunity is that the law encourages industry teamwork. Specifically in the automotive industry, we share the majority of our suppliers. So for maximum impact, it is helpful to collaborate. Unfortunately, we are not allowed to jointly work on supplier issues in a transparent manner because of the antitrust law. So I think that it explains that there is no easy to harvest low-hanging fruits. However, we have identified some opportunities while responding to the German due diligence law.
Right. Thank you for that. I think that it gives us a clear picture of how the sector in general still has a long way to go, and a lot of conversations, primarily in transparency and traceability, are to be had. But you have already highlighted some of the key issues. So I guess we'd like to dig a little bit deeper and ask, in Ford's opinion, what measures are needed to complement the already existing grievance mechanisms structures?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you're asking me for a wish list, Maria, even before Christmas,
yes.
There are three categories of help I would wish for. First, I would wish for that we as an industry foster our teamwork. I have to say many work streams are already ongoing, but I think we can still increase the collaboration, for example, on information exchange, including best practices, more focused work groups addressing the actual challenges, and the development of standards is always helpful to navigate through the complex requirements. Also, more support from the governments would help to generate more impact. And I've three suggestions here. First, trade agreements should always address human rights and environmental aspects. That would help us tremendously. Second, I would like to see more influence on governments in general with the aim to harmonize legislation. Currently, it's pretty scattered between the countries, and even outside Europe, some of the requirements are not covered in legislations. And third, legislations must focus more on practicality. And just very simple, as mentioned before, collaboration and the antitrust law does not go together very well. The third area of help is with organizations and NGOs. It would be helpful if local organizations would intensify communication and promotion of access to remedy on site. And my last wish is for help with building bridges. Building bridges between the industry, governments, and NGOs. We all share the same goals, so let's spend more resources on working together rather than on arguments. So in summary, I wish for more alignment and more collaboration on all levels.
Right. I mean, the list is not too long, but I think this is This is a good start, especially, I mean, we set up this exchange platform to talk about these issues and try to cross-sectorally address them in any way that we can. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's a great wish list. I'll just ask you a last question, because we are talking about sharing responsibility with suppliers. So I guess the last questions is more focused on the suppliers. So how can they be empowered and supported to take on the big task of sharing responsibility with buyers when it comes to HRED requirements and specifically grievance mechanisms?
Yeah, that's really a good question, and honestly, I would like to answer the question by sharing some of our recent initiatives that we started to prepare our buyers and suppliers. However, I have to admit, as we are still learning, and that is for sure not the silver bullet. But anyhow, let me just share what we did first, and very important is the issuance of our supplier code of conduct, because this document communicates what we are expecting from our suppliers. It also refers to, of course, human rights and the environmental requirements. And approval and adherence is a prerequisite for doing business with Ford. We also gave a heads up beginning of the year. We reminded our suppliers and buyers that we see new sustainability requirements are coming into force, and that was in view of the German supply chain due diligence law. Training. Yeah, we developed and issued mandatory training for our buyers. This training explains the impact caused by the legislations and also the responsibilities that comes with it. At the end, all the buyers have to pass a small exam to make sure that the content was really understood. And to learn, we initiated a pilot with 20 suppliers on the implementation of a grievance mechanism. And through the consequent dialogue, we received valuable feedback for providing access to remedy. And I think that helped the suppliers as well as us through that dialogue. And then we decided to facilitate the introduction of a compliant grievance mechanism. So we offered the workers' voices applications that I introduced before to our suppliers for free. Consequently, we provided webinars on how to establish a grievance mechanism with the workers' voices app. And last and probably most important, we recognize that we have a lot of room for improvement. So we are constantly learning and adopting as we continue our journey towards sustainable supplier networks. So the described activities are, as I mentioned, by no means best practice. However, maybe, hopefully, it serves as a thought starter for you and your businesses.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you, Helmut. I think this is the reason why we invited companies. We wanted to share experience and by no means say that they are best practices, but maybe somebody else in the audience may be very happy to hear whatever Ford is doing, and they would want to implement it themselves in their own company. So thank you for the interesting insights. And I take away from your input that there are indeed opportunities to maybe level the playing field for suppliers and hence avenues for companies towards access to remedy for workers. And I think if we want to achieve coordinated efforts, there has to be more dialogue, more industry exchange, and eye-level cooperation and investment in production companies is also needed. So thank you very much, Helmut. And
thank you.
We are a little bit short in time, so I'll move on to our last speaker, but from the textile sector. So Fatima Fatima Chowdhury from Tchibo. It's an honor to have you here. And of course, the questions are rather the same for you, Fatima, than they were for Helmut. Thank you for being part of the panel. So let me just dive right in. What does Tchibo do to comply with HRDD requirements, specifically on grievance mechanisms and remedy? And could you highlight how Tchibo works with its suppliers towards this goal?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Thank you for organizing and also inviting me to this webinar. As a short introduction, I'm Fatima Chowdhury from Tchibo. I'm part of the Tchibo Corporate Responsibility Human Rights team. And Tchibo is a retailer and brand, not only for textile, but it also has hard goods and also coffee. So I'm more focused on the non-food side, so including textile and in the South Asian countries. So coming back to your question, what does Tchibo do? Of course, effective grievance mechanism system has always been an important topic for us. So what we do at two levels, I would say. The first is, of course, receiving those grievances and addressing those grievances. We have different grievance channels. We are a member of Act on Living Wage. We have a global framework agreement with Industrial Global Union. We are also part of International Accord. So with this, through these channels, we receive complaints from the production units either through union or directly through workers. We also have an email which is shared with all our suppliers. Anyone can reach out to that email address and share their grievances. We have colleagues who are visiting factories on regular basis, not to all the production units, but for example, I'm based in Bangladesh. We have colleagues in Hong Kong who are visiting China units and so on. So they also act as a grievance channel. We also have a human rights dialogue-based human rights program, which are running almost close to 100 factories in our supply chain. So the we facilitators who go to these factories regularly, they can also be a channel to receive grievances. So these are the channels through which we receive grievances. That's one part, but the more important part is what do we do with those grievances? So one is looking at the issue that has come to us. Our priority is to address that and resolve that. But we also look at the root cause or the systematic violation that might happen in the factory. How do we address those? One thing you can ask that why do we have so many grievance channels? Because we believe that if one particular grievance channel is not accessible by someone, if someone doesn't have access to email, that person can reach out either to, if in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, to a code, or if have union, then through to the unions. So that's why we have different grievance channels to make it an effective system so that we have enough grievance. We are able to receive grievances from our supply chain. Yeah.
Okay, but so we know that sounds quite interesting. But besides being a member of industry initiatives, Tchibo has created as well its own program, right, with the goal of supporting its suppliers, improve social dialogue at factory level. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and how besides grievance mechanisms, how does Tchibo come to remediation when allegations come along its supply chain?
As I said, that we don't look at the grievances as a single case, because I will give you an example. For example, a worker has been harassed by his or her supervisor, right? So one remedy is, of course, stopping that particular supervisor or giving remedy to the complainant. But when we look deeper, this could be that the factory has a practice that the supervisors are using abusive words, using putting pressure on the workers. Or give you another example: a worker comes to us that he or she has been fired because he or she has been tried to form union, and he wants his job back. if you look at only this grievance, and the remedy for that is to reinstatement of that worker. But if you go deeper, the issue is not only about reinstatement of worker. It's about that the factory is not allowing the workers to exercise their freedom of association right freely. Right. And that's where our WE program, it's a dialogue-based human rights program, which brings the management and worker together and also the union representative together and have courageous conversation about the human rights issues, which could be health and safety, which could be sexual harassment and discrimination. Because if you only look at single solution for that single event, it's not impacting the systematic change in the factory. For us, it's really important that, of course, we are receiving the grievances and addressing those. But what about the long-term changes in the factory, in for our suppliers? We want to continue work with them, and we also want to see things improving. And that's where WE program steps in. It's a very collaborative way of working with the suppliers, working with the workers, managers, and every level of management. I'm talking about supervisors, line chief, owner, the union leaders, everyone, and bringing them together. Because instead of us as an European brand saying that this is the solution for you, it's not never going to work. Rather, the solution should come from within the factory, what works for them. And I'm also saying that the solution could be different. For what works for Bangladesh will never work for Vietnam, or what works for a textile factory can never work for a hard goods factory. And because WE program works in all those different sectors, we know that how different it is culturally, nationally. So we work with that individual characteristics of each factory, try to develop solution together with them, which works for them. And that's how we support also the grievance mechanism, because for us, it's important that the grievance mechanism in the factory is also effective. Why a grievance is coming to us? Because the complainant do not have trust in the system, that either there is no system at all in the factory, or they don't trust the system in the factory. So we should not only look at what has come to us, but we also should look at what is not working in that production unit, and we try to support that so that the repetition of such should not happen.
Thank you so much for the statement, Fatima. I think this is crucial. It's a great point to make, especially now speaking of sharing responsibility with suppliers. I think that the relationship between buyer and supplier should reach a point where they can have these conversations, right, and how to collaboratively approach the topic of root causes in grievance mechanisms and grievances in general. But so you have already highlighted some of the challenges. Maybe mention a couple more of challenges or opportunities that Tchibo has identified in its journey to help workers get access to remedy.
So the challenges there are many challenges. Handling grievance cases are not easy. One of the challenges we see is when we receive a grievance from an external, either organizations, or the workers are reaching out to unions or NGOs, whoever, this puts the factory in a very uncomfortable, I would say even a defensive position, that why my worker has reached out to an external organization. And so for us, this is, I would say, what we ask as a brand, as the customer of that supplier. We say, look, we don't want to be the judge of the situation, because we know how complex human rights could be. What we want is to engage in dialogue with the complainant and reach to a resolution. And the resolution could be anything as long as these two parties agree. This is not as easy as I am describing. It needs a lot of conversation. It needs a lot of trust building as well, because engaging in dialogue is, you can understand the power dynamics that exist between the workers or the complainant and the management, bringing them to the same table engage in conversation which are very sensitive. It could be about sexual harassment, it could be about freedom of association, or it could be about wages, which are also not easy. So we try to do that resolution is not, or the solution is not coming from us. You should decide together with the complainant what could be an effective solution. And as long as this is acceptable to the complainant, we are absolutely fine with it. So to reach that process is quite challenging, but we have also had good experiences once we have created enough trust throughout the process.
And in Tchibo's opinion, besides engaging in dialogue and building trust, how can suppliers be empowered and supported to take on the big task of sharing responsibility when it comes to HREDD requirements?
I think the first thing our suppliers have to understand, and they are also understanding this, that this is not a Tchibo requirement anymore. If you have European customers today or tomorrow, all of your customers are going to talk about it. It is going to be their requirement. That understanding that it's not coming as a single brand requirement. It's now law. It's now applicable for almost everyone. So that, and we are supporting that process. We are having different trainings with our supplier. We are sharing the supply chain law of Germany, which we have already shared. Once the European law comes, we will also going to build capacity on that. We are saying that, look, we want to support you to build an effective grievance mechanism system in your factory. Whatever does it mean? If after having that system, a lot of grievances come, that's also fine with us. There will be no punishment from our side that why there are so many grievances. As long as you have true willingness to resolve those grievances and also work on your system and policy, you have full support from us. Only thing is, if we don't see that things are not changing, if we see that they are stuck or there is not enough willingness to improve, that's I would say, the escalation point for us, that we want to support as long as our suppliers are willing to work with that support.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatima. I think Tchibo's approach shows that there are indeed avenues to cooperate closer with suppliers in helping them improve social dialogue and contribute to their in-factory grievance mechanism. So this in turn can help, of course, buying companies remain accountable while collaborating with its business partners. So thank you very much for those very interesting insights, Fatima. Seeing now the time, we have 10 minutes left, so we can quickly proceed to our Q&A session. Let me start with a question to all speakers. And maybe you can quickly give me just one tip per speaker. We have a question from someone. I represent a multi-brand retailer, a London-based department store called Liberty. Our own brand is just one of many that we retail, and there are thousands of suppliers involved in our entire supply network. So what is the best way forward for us in terms of establishing an effective grievance mechanism that would be accessible to all of our suppliers? Do you have maybe one tip for this person?
Yeah, maybe I start. We have a similar situation. We had a lengthy discussion on, I think it primarily depends on your relation with these suppliers. If you're constantly in contact, that might be different, but I assume as it is very complex and the resources are limited, I would definitely go for like we have on our web channels. So it's an easy to access web-based thing, and you could go with or start with a communication that this is accessible and build it into your contracts that these channels are promoted. That would be the first step, but then the collaboration starts. But I would go with a one-fits-all web channel in this case. Very practical, as always.
Thank you, Helmut. Fatima, do you have maybe a tip to give?
For me, as I explained, I would say that maybe a bit contradictory to Helmut, that don't think about one single channel, because if you think about how spread the suppliers are in different countries, you have to take into consideration that the illiteracy, the lack of access to smartphones, and all the context to it. So I would say take those into consideration, and if you are thinking about one single channel, please also incorporate those limitations as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Yeah, these are indeed very diverse answers. Maybe a question for Valérie from someone. I'm currently conducting research to understand how access to remedies could be provided for in the future EU regulation on forced labor. My questions are, maybe the first one, how would you envision remediation of forced labor to be provided in such a context?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for the question. On the first question, I would add on what Helmut and Fatima have said, the importance of consulting with workers, consulting with workers' representatives, because indeed there might be issues the management cannot think of. And indeed, as Fatima pointed out, issues of illiteracy or accessibility. So to me, effectiveness of the grievance handling is also closely connected to proper consultation with the workers. And as Helmut said, also, I mean, taking into account the whole network of cases. Thank you for the question on forced labor. This is a complicated question, of course, hard to answer quickly, but I think what is important is to ensure that the legal framework is in place. And from an ILO perspective, what we tend to see is that in some instances, the labor law, the legal framework is in place. There's a clear prohibition of forced labor, child labor, but the labor law does not apply to many sectors or categories of workers or enterprises in the country. So basically, there's an issue of scope, there's an issue of coverage. Workers in the informal economy tend not to be covered. Small companies, small business, family-owned business tend not to be covered by the legal framework. So having the appropriate legal framework and an appropriate scope of the labor law is key. But then it goes back to having a strong labor dispute resolution system, different levels, but also ensuring that national authorities, labor inspection, compliance, enforcement authorities can also access all workplaces. And I would say when it comes to issues of forced labor, child labor, grievance handling might not be and it's surely not the only remedy. When it comes to gross violation of fundamental labor rights, it should be channeled to the judicial system, to the national system of dispute resolution. So I would say grievance handling has its limitation when it comes to the nature of certain claims, and this is really important to emphasize. And then again, I think freedom of association, the right to organize, ensuring that workers can voice their concern, that workers are empowered also to voice concerns about child labor, forced labor. This is really key. Freedom of association and collective bargaining are enabling rights. I mean, this is repeated over and over again, but it is really at the end of the day critical, of course, and key for effective mechanisms. Many other issues could be raised. I'm happy to continue the discussion with that person outside this framework if she wishes.
Thank you very much, Valérie, for a full response on that. I'll ask another question to Fatima. I think this is a great one. How do we avoid grievance channel fatigue, where all customer brands are setting up their own grievance channel in their supply chain, which leads to multiple posters of dozens of grievance channels at manufacturers? You know the issue. So how do we avoid that?
I think that's a very important question and a very valid one. Even though I talked about different grievance channels, but if you look at the players like ACT on Living Wage, ACT as grievance channels, or the global framework agreement we have, or international accord. So with all these, we are partnering with the unions. So for us, it's really important that the factories exercise the right of freedom of association, or unions or federation has access to the workers so that the workers are truly represented. So even if we have different channels, true worker representation is the very, I would say, the priority for us. And that could be one way of, avoiding grievance channels fatigue, that not about different channels, but whether worker representation, the worker representatives are the true representatives. They can bring out the grievances and also address the grievances together with the management.
Thank you for that answer, Fatima. This is something we do in the Initiative for Global Solidarity too. We do support grievance backup or external grievance mechanisms, and that's one of our prerequisites. That if we support a grievance mechanism, it has to have to factor in a worker representation. Otherwise, that's a criteria where we discard any support measure we do. So I can only highlight what you just mentioned, Fatima. I'll pose just one last question for Helmut because we don't have that much time. This is a question that interests me as well. Helmut, can you go into the antitrust concerns when working with suppliers in a little more detail? Could you explain why antitrust law prevents collaboration?
Yeah, I was actually hoping for that question. And that is that's not a fault thing that is shared among all the automotive manufacturers, and also when we work in organizations, is that we must not disclose the suppliers we are working with, because that would give away information that could help with negotiation and pricing eventually. If you have information on your competitor's supply base, you could, draw conclusions about capacities, etc. So I don't go into details, but I think that roughly explains the issue. Hence, we cannot disclose to each other where we are buying our parts from. Hence, if we have a grievance and we have sometimes an indication that we are not alone, but we cannot go to each other and say, look, are you also my customer of this or that supplier? Let's team up, let's increase our leverage, let's work, let's try to understand the root cause, what is the appropriate remedy, etc., etc. So that's basically the issue, and this is why I mentioned that we need, in this case, to have a third party that we refer to. Sometimes you have an indication, and as I said, in most cases in the automotive industry, you're not alone. We share most of our suppliers, so it's really essential that we have a third party that helps with industry collaboration and teaming up, but anonymous, or making it anonymous to a certain extent, and filter the information so that it's not an issue with the antitrust law. I hope that explains the issue.
Thank you, Helmut. I know that the textile sector has had many conversations around this topic, especially some years ago. So maybe this is a point where the automotive and electronic sector can have a deeper conversation, maybe exchange with the textile sector, how they have tackled this. But anyways, I have to finish to round up our panel. And thank you all very much for attending. I would like to highlight a couple of takeaways just very quickly. So we know now that there are international frameworks that provide companies guidance on how to set up in-factory grievance mechanisms. These can contribute to a buying company's efforts to create access to remedy for its supply chain while sharing their responsibility with its suppliers. Different sectors have different levels of maturity in the area of remedy and grievance mechanisms. However, the identified opportunities by industry mostly lie in the areas where conversations have yet to take place with additional stakeholders that may have a say in how to support and improve working conditions for workers and their access to remedy. Additionally, the conversation on shared responsibility with suppliers may vary greatly, depending on the relationship to the supplier and on the overall supply structures of the industry, supply networks. However, one thing is certain in every case. Suppliers need to be able to understand what is meant with HREDD. They should understand why setting up grievance mechanism does not only help buying companies comply with mandatory due diligence law, but rather that it helps their own operations and their productivity of its workers. They should be able to identify the added value of being part of a due diligence process. Otherwise, buying companies end up once more exerting pressure on the supply chain, which further emphasizes overburdening its business partners and contributing to greater power imbalances. So industry needs to seriously think of long-term sustainable measures to work collaboratively with suppliers. But what's even more important, this is not something that happens in a vacuum. There are other actors out there, namely civil society, for example, which are very much committed to the cause and with a crucial role in participating in grievance and remedy mechanisms. So let us think of joint solutions and seek support where it's already being offered, but probably not being heard. Maybe then industry can have a chance at surviving mandatory human rights due diligence laws in a sustainable manner. So thank you very much to our speakers who joined us today. Thank you to the audience for attending and for contributing to this knowledge sharing platform. Have a great rest of your day and see you next time.